The dog led the man to the rusty train. What he found inside was too incredible. Richard Thompson walked through the rural property he had inherited from his father 3 years ago, but which he had never truly been able to call home. The weight of debts and the feeling of not belonging to that place consumed him every day, especially after his sister Catherine had refused to speak with him since the division of assets. It was then that Snowball, the mutt that had appeared at his door a few months earlier, began barking in a strange and insistent way toward the back of the property. The dog had never shown so much interest in that overgrown area where the rusty tracks of an old railway disappeared into the dense vegetation. "What is it, Snowball?" murmured Richard, adjusting the straw hat on his head. The animal kept barking and running a few meters ahead, stopping to look back as if asking to be followed. It was clearly trying to lead him somewhere specific. Richard hesitated. He had work to do, bills to calculate, tough decisions about the property's future. But something about the dog's persistence intrigued him. Snowball was a smart animal who had already alerted him to snakes and other dangers a few times. "All right, let's see what you want to show me," he said, starting to follow the animal. They walked along a trail that Richard knew superficially but rarely traveled. The vegetation was denser than he remembered, with vines and branches forming a kind of green tunnel. The sound of his steps cracking dry twigs echoed through the afternoon silence. Snowball moved determinedly, occasionally stopping to sniff the air and make sure he was on the right path. Richard noticed they were approaching the abandoned tracks of the old Central American Railroad, which had stopped operating in the region over 40 years ago. When they finally reached the spot, Richard stopped in surprise. There, half hidden by the vegetation that had grown over the years, was an old locomotive completely rusted, followed by 2 train cars that seemed forgotten by time. "How have I never seen this before?" he murmured to himself. Snowball ran straight to one of the cars, climbing the small side ladder that still held up despite the rust. The dog barked again, this time even more insistently. Richard approached slowly. Rust had taken over almost the entire structure, but the car still seemed solid enough for careful exploration. He cautiously climbed the steps, testing each one before putting his full weight on it. The car door was ajar, stuck by rust and time. With some effort, he managed to push it open enough to get through. The interior was in shadows, but the light coming through the broken windows revealed something unexpected. It wasn't an ordinary passenger or freight car. It seemed to have been adapted as some kind of office or archive. There were wooden shelves against the walls, rusty metal drawers, and surprisingly many papers still preserved in boxes that had been protected from the rain by plastic tarps. Snowball sniffed everything with interest, but headed specifically to a box in the right corner of the car. "What did you find there, boy?" Richard approached the box indicated by the dog. It was a simple wooden box with metal hinges that had withstood time better. When he opened it, he found documents organized in folders yellowed with age. The first folder he picked up had written on the cover, "Railroad Project, Clearwater Section." His heart raced. Clearwater was exactly the name of the region where his property was located. He opened the folder carefully. The papers were surprisingly well preserved. They were blueprints, maps, and official documents dated from the 1940s. As he was flipping through, one word caught his attention: expropriation. Richard sat down on the dusty floor of the railroad car to read more carefully. The document talked about expropriations made by the federal government for the expansion of the railway line. As he read, he understood that several properties in the region had been expropriated, but the owners were supposed to receive compensation. His last name appeared on a list. Anthony Thompson, property 127 hectares, compensation authorized. Anthony Thompson was his grandfather, who had lost part of the family's land back then. Richard had always heard the story that the government had taken the land without paying anything, leaving the family in financial difficulties that lasted for generations. But there was the proof that the compensation had been approved and authorized. He kept searching through the documents, getting more and more nervous. In another folder he found receipts and payment vouchers. His heart was pounding as he looked for any reference to the name Thompson. "Oh my God," he murmured upon finding a document that made his hands tremble. It was a payment order dated August 15, 1947, for the amount of $50,000 intended for Anthony Thompson. regarding compensation for expropriation of 127 hectares in the Clearwater area. But there was a red stamp on the document. Beneficiary not located, awaiting pickup. Richard stayed silent for several minutes, processing the information. His grandfather had never received the money, probably because he didn't know it had been approved or couldn't find where to pick it up. Snowball approached and rested his head on his leg, as if understanding the importance of the moment. "Snowball, you brought me here for a reason, didn't you?" He continued, searching through the documents. There was a third folder, thicker than the others, with the title Pending Cases, Unclaimed Compensations. Inside it, he found at least 20 cases similar to his grandfather's. Families who never knew or never managed to claim the compensations due for the expropriations. As he read the documents, he began to understand why that railroad car was there, forgotten in the middle of the brush. It was probably a mobile archive used by the employees responsible for the compensations, which had been abandoned when the railroad project was interrupted. The sunlight was getting weaker, indicating that the day was coming to an end. Richard knew he needed to go back home, but first he carefully stored all the documents related to his family in the original box. During the way back, his mind was buzzing with possibilities. If those documents were legitimate and still valid, they could solve all his financial problems. More importantly, they could explain why his family had faced so many difficulties over the years. Arriving home, he turned on all the lights in the living room and spread the documents on the dining table. Snowball lay down at his feet, seeming satisfied with the work done. Richard picked up the phone and called his cousin Robert, who worked as a lawyer in the city. "Robert, it's me, Richard. I need to talk to you about something very important. Can you come here tomorrow morning?" "Of course, cousin. Did something happen?" "I found some old documents that could change everything. I can't explain over the phone, but it's serious." "All right, I'll be there at 9 in the morning." After hanging up, Richard looked at Snowball and said, "Thank you, boy. I don't know how you knew, but thank you." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. The next morning, Robert arrived promptly at 9 o'clock. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses who always conveyed seriousness in his gestures. "Richard, what's this all about? You seemed pretty upset on the phone yesterday. Have a seat, Robert. You won't believe what I'm about to tell you." Richard recounted the entire story from the previous day, from Snowball's strange behavior to the discovery of the documents in the abandoned railcar. Robert listened quietly, his expression growing more focused. "Let me see these documents," said Robert, adjusting his glasses. For over an hour, the lawyer carefully examined each paper, making notes on a notepad he always carried with him. "Richard, this is very serious," he said finally. "If these documents are authentic, you're entitled to a compensation that was never paid to your grandfather." "But that was over 70 years ago, Robert. Is it still valid?" "Government debts don't expire the same way regular debts do. I'll need to research it further, but I believe so. The problem will be proving the authenticity of the documents and finding the responsible agencies nowadays." Robert stopped talking for a moment, flipping through the papers again. "There's one thing that worries me, Richard. If these documents are so important, why were they abandoned in the middle of the woods? That doesn't make much sense." "I thought about that too. Maybe when the railroad project was cancelled, they simply forgot to clean out the archives. Or maybe someone didn't want these documents to be found," said Robert in a more serious tone. "What do you mean? Think about it. If there were 20 families in the same situation as yours, that represents a lot of money in compensation. Maybe someone has an interest in these cases never coming to light." Richard hadn't considered that possibility. The idea that someone might have intentionally hidden those documents made him uneasy. "What do you think we should do?" "First, I'll take copies of these documents to do a more detailed analysis at the office. Second, we'll need to go to that rail car together so I can see everything personally. And third, don't mention this to anyone else for now." "Why the secrecy?" "Because if someone really hid these documents, they might not be happy to know they've been found. Let's take it slow until we understand the situation better." They agreed that Robert would return the next day with a professional photographer to document everything in the rail car. The idea was to have complete evidence before taking any legal action. That night, Richard could barely sleep. His mind kept processing all the possibilities. If he could prove the right to compensation, he might not only save the property, but also help his sister Catherine, with whom he had had a bitter fight during the division of their father's estate. The fight had been about money, as always. Catherine thought Richard had gotten the better part of the inheritance, while he argued that he had taken on all the debts along with the land. The argument had ended with her storming out of the house, shouting that she never wanted to see him again. That had happened 3 years ago, and since then they hadn't exchanged a single word. The next day, Robert arrived accompanied by a photographer named Michael, a young man of about 30 who carried professional equipment. "Richard, Michael is trustworthy. I explained the situation and he's going to help us document everything." The three of them, accompanied by Snowball, headed to the abandoned rail car. The walk took about 20 minutes, and Richard took the opportunity to show Robert other parts of the property. "Wow, it's much more preserved than I imagined," said Michael upon seeing the rail car. "Yeah, the vegetation protected it from most of the weather," explained Richard. Michael photographed everything: the exterior of the rail car, the abandoned tracks, the locomotive, and especially the interior with all the documents. Robert conducted a thorough inspection, searching for any detail that could help better understand the situation. "Richard, look here," he said, pointing to a stack of documents in a different drawer. "These papers are more recent." The documents were dated 1963 and discussed a review of pending compensation cases from the old railroad. "My God, Robert, look at this." On one of the papers, there was a handwritten note: "Cases archived by superior order, await instructions," and an illegible signature. "Someone ordered these cases to be archived," murmured Robert. "This confirms my suspicion that there was some kind of interference." Michael continued photographing everything, while Richard and Robert organized the documents by date and relevance. That was when Robert found something that completely changed the course of the investigation. "Richard, you need to see this." It was a letter dated 1964, signed by someone with the last name Williams. The letter said, "As we discussed, all documents related to the pending compensation cases from the Clearwater section must remain archived indefinitely. Paying these compensations would bring unnecessary political and financial problems. The files will be transferred to a secure location until further notice." "Williams," murmured Richard. "That name sounds familiar." "It should," said Robert with a serious expression. "John Williams was mayor of this region for over 20 years, between 1960 and 1980. Later, his son Robert Williams took over and stayed for another 10 years. Today, the local politics are run by his grandson, Frank Williams." "Are you saying the Williams family intentionally hid these compensations?" "I'm saying there are very strong indications of that. And if it's true, they were responsible for decades of suffering for many families in the region." Richard felt a mix of anger and sadness. His family had gone through financial hardships that marked generations, all because of a compensation that had been approved but never paid. "Robert, what do we do now?" "Now we take all this to a public prosecutor I know. This is at least a case of administrative misconduct." They finished documenting and returned to Richard's home. During lunch, Robert explained the next steps in more detail. "I'll need a few days to organize everything and consult other lawyers who work on similar cases. Meanwhile, you can't talk about this with anyone. If the Williamses find out what we've discovered, they might try to interfere." "All right, but Robert, there's something I need to tell you." "What?" "Catherine is living in the city, very close to the notary's office where Frank Williams's daughter works. If this story comes out, she'll be one of the first to know." Robert stopped eating and looked seriously at Richard. "Is your sister still angry with you?" "She hasn't spoken to me in 3 years." "Richard, you'll need to talk to her. If she finds out from other people and knows you knew beforehand, she'll be even angrier. Besides, she's also your grandfather's heir, so she's entitled to half the compensation." Richard sighed. The idea of seeking out Catherine and admitting she was right about the family's financial struggles was not at all pleasant. "I'll think about it." "There's no time to think. You need to talk to her today." After Robert and Michael left, Richard stayed home, brooding over the situation. Snowball seemed to sense his tension and stayed close, resting his head on his leg whenever he saw him more worried. In the late afternoon, he mustered his courage and decided to go into town to look for Catherine. She lived in a simple house downtown, which she had bought with her share of the inheritance. Richard parked the car in front of the gate and spent a few minutes trying to decide what to say. Finally, he got out and knocked on the gate. Catherine appeared at the window, and when she saw him, she made a face of displeasure. "What do you want here, Richard?" "Catherine, I need to talk to you. It's important. If it's about money, you can leave. I don't want to hear about it anymore." "It's not about money, or rather it is, but not in the way you're thinking." She hesitated for a few seconds before opening the gate. 5 minutes. "I don't have time for your conversations." Richard entered his sister's simple but well-kept house. Catherine had always had good taste in decoration, and even with few resources, she had created a cozy atmosphere. "Catherine, do you remember the stories Grandpa Anthony used to tell about the railroad?" "I remember. He always said the government stole the family's land and never paid anything." "Well, it seems he was wrong." Richard told the whole story of the last 2 days, from Snowball's behavior to the discovery of the documents. Catherine listened to everything in silence, but her expression gradually changed from disinterest to surprise, and then to a mixture of hope and distrust. "Are you telling me our family is entitled to money that was never paid?" "Exactly, and it's not a small amount. $50,000 in 1947 would be a lot of money today with inflation and interest. And why are you telling me this? Since when do you care about me?" Catherine's question stung Richard. He knew he had been selfish during the inheritance division, but he didn't imagine she held so much resentment. "Catherine, I know I was wrong when Dad passed away. I know I was selfish and only thought of myself. But this is different. This is about justice. And you're my sister, you're the daughter of the same father, granddaughter of the same grandfather. You have as much right as I do." She remained silent for a few minutes, looking at her own hands. "Richard, you have no idea how hard it was for me to accept that I lost not only my father, but also my brother at the same time." "What do you mean?" "When you decided to keep the land and left me only with the money, I felt like you were choosing the estate over family, as if the land were more important than me." Richard had never thought of it from that angle. For him, keeping the land meant taking on all the debts and responsibilities, while she was free to start over. "I thought I was protecting you from the debts." "I didn't want protection, Richard. I wanted to be with you, to solve the problems together as a family. But you decided for me." The conversation was taking a turn Richard hadn't expected, but perhaps it was necessary. "Catherine, can I ask you a question?" "Go ahead." "If these documents are real and we manage to get the compensation, would you agree for us to be real siblings again?" "Richard, we never stopped being siblings. The problem is you never treated me as an equal. You always thought you knew what was best for me. You're right, and I'm sorry for that." Catherine got up and went to the kitchen, returning with 2 glasses of water. "All right. Let's see where this document story goes. But this time, any decision that needs to be made, we make it together." Agreed. They talked for another hour, and for the first time in 3 years, Richard felt like he was talking to the sister he had known since childhood. When he said goodbye, Catherine said, "Richard, thank you for coming to tell me. I know it wasn't easy. Thank you for listening." The next day, Robert called early with news. "Richard, I spoke with the public prosecutor. He's very interested in the case and wants to see all the documents today. Can you come here?" "Of course, I'll bring my sister along." "Catherine, you two worked things out?" "We're trying." At the public prosecutor's office, Dr. Henry Sanders, a man of about 50 with a serious and determined air, carefully examined all the documents Richard and Catherine had brought. "These documents seem authentic," he said after a detailed analysis, "but I'll need a technical examination for absolute certainty." "How long does that take?" asked Catherine. "About 2 weeks. Meanwhile, I'll start investigating the Williams family's history in local public administration." Dr. Sanders explained that if the documents were confirmed as authentic, They would have a very strong case against the municipal administration. You need to be prepared for a long battle. The Williams family has held significant political power in the region for decades. They won't give up easily. Doctor, what would the compensation amount be today? Asked Richard. It's hard to calculate precisely, but we're talking about a figure that could reach $500,000 for each of you, maybe more. Richard and Catherine exchanged glances, both surprised by the amount. Leaving the notary's office, they decided to have lunch together to discuss the next steps. Richard, did you notice the prosecutor said it's going to be a long battle? I did. Are you scared? A little. The Williams family is indeed powerful. Frank Williams has been a state representative for 2 terms. Catherine, no matter how powerful they are. If they did something wrong, they'll have to answer for it. During lunch, they planned how to handle the situation in the coming days. They decided to keep it confidential until they were sure of the document's authenticity. But not everything would go as planned. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. 3 days later, when Richard was tending to the animals in the late afternoon, a black car stopped in front of his house. 2 men in suits got out and approached with an official air. Good afternoon. Are you Richard Thompson? Yes, I am. How can I help you? We're from Representative Frank Williams's office. He would like to speak with you about a private matter. Richard felt a chill in his stomach. How had the Williams family found out about the documents so quickly? What kind of matter? It would be better to discuss it in person. The representative can meet you tomorrow at 9 in the morning in his office. And if I don't want to go? The 2 men exchanged glances before one of them replied, Mr. Thompson, I believe it's in your best interest to speak with the representative. He has information that could be useful to you. After the men left, Richard immediately called Robert. Robert, they found out. What do you mean? Richard told him about the visit from Frank Williams's aides. That's not a good sign, Richard. Someone leaked the information. But who could have leaked it? Only you, me, Catherine, and the prosecutor know about the case. And the photographer. And there could be other people in the prosecutor's office who found out. What should I do? Should I go to the meeting or not? Robert was silent for a few seconds before answering. Yes, go, but I'll come with you. And we'll record everything. Is that legal? If the meeting is in a public place like an official office, yes. The next day, Richard and Robert met in front of the City Hall building, where Frank Williams maintained a local office. Frank Williams was a man of about 45, with well-groomed hair, an expensive suit, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He received them in a luxurious office, with fine wood furniture, and several photos of himself with important politicians. Mr. Thompson, thank you for accepting my invitation. You must be wondering how I found out about your discovery. Yes, I am. Information is power, Mr. Thompson, especially in a small town like ours. But I'm not here to threaten anyone. On the contrary, I'm here to help. Frank Williams stood up and went to a shelf, from which he took a folder. Take a look, he said, placing some documents on the table. Birth certificates, marriage records, property deeds, everything related to your grandfather, Anthony Thompson. Richard flipped through the documents, not understanding where Frank was going with this. There's something interesting in these documents, Mr. Thompson. Your grandfather was never the legal owner of the lands that were supposedly expropriated. What do you mean? Anthony Thompson was a caretaker for a farmer named Colonel Augustus Fletcher. The lands belonged to the colonel, not your grandfather. Richard felt the world spin. If this were true, the whole discovery of the documents in the railroad car would be useless. That doesn't make sense, said Robert. The expropriation documents clearly mention Anthony Thompson as the owner. Exactly, replied Frank with a smile. There was an administrative error at the time. My grandfather, John Williams, who was the mayor back then, discovered the mistake before the payment was made. That's why the documents were filed away. And why didn't they correct the error? Because Colonel Fletcher had passed away, and his heirs had sold the lands to other buyers. It was a very complicated legal situation. Frank Williams leaned back in his chair with the air of someone telling a story they had rehearsed many times. Mr. Thompson, my family has been managing this region for 3 generations. We've always tried to do what's best for everyone. If we kept these documents archived, it was to avoid bigger problems." "What kind of problems?" asked Robert. "Imagine if we had paid compensation to someone who wasn't entitled to it. And imagine if other families in the region found out and started questioning their own properties. It would be legal chaos." Richard was confused. Frank Williams's version made sense, but something about it didn't ring true. "Congressman, may I see these documents you brought?" "Of course. You can even take copies." Robert carefully examined each paper. They all seemed authentic, with stamps and signatures from that time. "Mr. Thompson," Frank continued, "we don't want to fight with you. On the contrary, I know your family has faced financial difficulties over the years, and that saddens me. Where are you going with this?" "I want to propose an agreement. My family has several businesses in the region. I can offer a good job for you and your sister. Besides, I can help with special financing to improve your property." "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for you dropping this whole story about the railroad car documents. We forget all about it and move on." Robert nudged Richard discreetly, indicating he shouldn't accept anything at that moment. "Congressman, I need to talk with my sister before making any decision." Of course, but don't take too long. Offers like this don't stay open forever." Leaving the office, Richard was visibly shaken. "Robert, what if he's right? What if my grandfather really wasn't the owner of the lands?" "Richard, calm down. First, let's verify the authenticity of these documents he showed. Second, even if your grandfather was a caretaker, that doesn't explain why there were compensation documents in his name." "What do you mean?" "If there was an administrative error, why did they make payment documents? Why didn't they just cancel the process?" Robert was right. There was something odd about Frank Williams's story. They went straight to Catherine's house to tell her what had happened. "Richard, do you believe what that man said?" asked Catherine after hearing the whole story. "I don't know. The documents seemed real." "But think about it," said Catherine. "If our family has always struggled because of this land story, how could our grandfather have told this wrong story to everyone? Maybe he didn't know he was just a caretaker." "Richard, Grandpa Anthony was a simple man, but he wasn't a fool. He knew very well what his situation was." Catherine was right. Her grandfather always spoke in detail about the lands, the crops, the animals. He didn't sound like someone who was just an employee. "What do you think we should do?" asked Robert. "Let's keep investigating," said Catherine with determination. "If the Williamses are in such a hurry to convince us to give up, it's because they have something to hide." "Catherine is right," agreed Richard. "Let's see what the prosecutor finds in the document examination." But Frank Williams wasn't willing to wait. The next morning, Richard woke up to the sound of tractors on his property. He left the house and saw 3 heavy machines accompanied by several men. One of the men approached with a paper in his hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm a court officer. I have here an injunction order for your property." "An injunction? How come?" "There's a lawsuit questioning the legitimacy of your deed. Until the case is resolved, you cannot make any improvements to the property." Richard took the paper and read it quickly. The lawsuit had been filed by a law firm representing heirs of Colonel Augustus Fletcher. "This is a setup," murmured Richard. The court officer didn't want to get into discussions and just did his job, placing an injunction seal on the property gate. Richard immediately called Robert. "Robert, they've placed an injunction on my property." "How?" Richard explained what had happened. "Richard, this is psychological pressure. They want to make you desperate so you'll accept their offer. And now we go to the property registry office to research the entire chain of title for your property. If we can prove it was legally acquired by your family, we can overturn this injunction." At the registry office, Robert requested all the historical documentation for Richard's property. The registrar, a man about 60 years old named Sebastian, was very helpful. "This property has an interesting history," said Sebastian while searching through the old files. "I've researched it a few times over the years." "What do you mean?" asked Robert. "About 20 years ago, someone had already questioned the legitimacy of this deed, but at the time we managed to prove everything was in order." Sebastian brought a thick folder with old documents. Look here, deed of purchase from 1934, when Anthony Thompson acquired the lands directly from Colonel Augustus Fletcher. He bought the lands? Asked Richard, surprised. Yes, he did. Here's the payment receipt, with notarized signature authentication. Robert examined the documents carefully. Sebastian, are these documents authentic? Of course they are. They've been in our archives for almost 100 years. Then why did Frank Williams say my grandfather was just a caretaker? I don't know, son. But I can assure you your grandfather was the legitimate owner of these lands. Richard felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief from knowing his family truly had rights to the lands, and anger from realizing Frank Williams had blatantly lied. Sebastian, can I get certified copies of all these documents? Of course, but it will take a few hours to prepare everything. While they waited, Robert and Richard talked about the next steps. Richard, now I'm sure the Williamses are hiding something much bigger than we imagined. Why? Think about it. If they really just wanted to clear up a misunderstanding, why did they lie about your grandfather being a caretaker? Why did they place an injunction on your property? Do you think they knew about the railroad car documents for a long time? I think so, and I think there are other secrets we haven't discovered yet. When Sebastian finished preparing the copies, Robert asked if he knew of other similar cases in the region. Funny you should ask that, said Sebastian. A few years ago, an elderly lady named Mrs. Elaine came here looking for her family's documents. She said her grandfather had lost land to the railroad and never received compensation. What happened to her? She gave up the search after some people from City Hall talked to her. She said it wasn't worth stirring up trouble. Is this Mrs. Elaine still alive? Yes, she is. She lives near the main church. Robert and Richard exchanged glances. They needed to talk to Mrs. Elaine. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Mrs. Elaine Sanders was an 82-year-old lady, small and thin, but with lively eyes and an extremely sharp mind. She received them on the porch of her simple home, offering coffee and homemade cookies. Have you come to ask about my grandfather's lands? She said after Robert explained the reason for their visit. Yes, Mum. We're investigating cases of compensation that were never paid during the railroad era. Mrs. Elaine took a deep breath before starting to speak. My grandfather, Benjamin Sanders, lost 40 hectares when they built the railroad. It was the best part of the property, where the main house and orchard were. Do you know if he received any compensation? He always said no, that the government had stolen the lands. But a few years ago, when I was going through old papers, I found something strange. Mrs. Elaine went inside and returned with a shoebox full of old documents. Look here, she said, showing a yellowed paper. It's a notice that the compensation had been approved and that my grandfather was supposed to appear at a location to receive it. Did he go? No, because he never received this notice. I found it among other papers, but it was sealed, as if it had never been opened. Robert examined the document. It was similar to the ones they had found in the railway car. Mrs. Elaine, how did this notice reach you if your grandfather never received it? That's the strange part of the story. After he passed away, a gentleman showed up here saying he was from City Hall, that he was cleaning out old archives. He brought a box with my grandfather's papers and said, "We thought you might like to have this as a keepsake." Who was this gentleman? At the time, I was young and didn't pay much attention, but I remember he said he worked for Mayor Williams. Richard and Robert exchanged glances. Another connection to the Williams family. Mrs. Elaine, did you try to investigate these documents? I tried about 15 years ago. I went to City Hall, I went to the notary's office, I talked to lawyers, but they always discouraged me, saying it was a waste of time and that I had no chance of winning anything. Who discouraged you? Mainly the people from City Hall. They said the Williams family had always helped the city a lot, that it wasn't worth causing problems for them over old things. Mrs. Elaine served more coffee and continued her story. But I always suspected there were more families in the same situation. Sometimes in church conversations, similar stories would come up. What kind of stories? Mr. Tobias, who passed away about 10 years ago, always said his father had lost land to the railroad. Mrs. Martha also had a similar story, and there's the case of the late Joshua, who was very close to my family. What happened to Joshua? He was the only one who really tried to fight it in court. He hired a lawyer from the capital, gathered documents, did all the paperwork. And did he get anything? No. The lawyer disappeared with all the documents and the money Joshua had paid. After that, he gave up on everything. Robert was taking notes on everything, Mrs. Elaine said. Do you remember the name of that lawyer? I do. His name was Dr. Reynolds. He had an office there in Pleasant View. Mrs. Elaine, would you be willing to join us in this investigation? I would. I'm old now. I'm not afraid of anything anymore, and I've always believed my grandfather was entitled to that money. Leaving Mrs. Elaine's house, Richard was increasingly convinced there was an organized conspiracy to hide the compensation payments. Robert, how many families do you think were harmed? From what Mrs. Elaine told us, it must be at least 5 or 6 families. That represents a lot of money. We need to find the descendants of all those families. First, let's research this lawyer Reynolds. If he disappeared with Joshua's documents, there might have been something criminal behind it. In Robert's office, they spent the rest of the afternoon researching online about lawyer Reynolds. They found nothing about him disappearing with documents, but they discovered something interesting. Richard, look at this, said Robert, pointing at the computer screen. Dr. Reynolds didn't disappear, he just moved to another town. Where to? To Clearwater, and look where his office is now. The screen showed the address, Flower Street, 45, Williams Shopping Centre building. He works for the Williamses? Asked Richard. At least he works in their building. This can't be a coincidence. Robert called Dr. Reynolds' office and scheduled an appointment for the next day without mentioning the real reason. That night, Richard had dinner at Catherine's house. He told her everything about the conversation with Mrs. Elaine and the discovery about lawyer Reynolds. Richard, don't you think we're messing with dangerous people? What do you mean, dangerous? Think about it. If the Williamses really hid compensation from several families for decades, they won't let us destroy all that easily. Catherine, are you scared? A little. But I'm also angry. If our family went through hardships because of these people, they need to pay for it. So shall we continue? We will, but carefully. The next day, Robert and Richard went to Dr. Reynolds' office. It was a small but well-organized office on the 3rd floor of the commercial building. Dr. Reynolds was a man about 60 years old, bald, with thick glasses and a nervous way of speaking. How can I help you? He asked after they settled in. Doctor, we're from a family that had land expropriated during the railroad era. We want to know about our rights. Dr. Reynolds became visibly uncomfortable with the question. Look, this kind of case is very complicated. Too much time has passed. Documents got lost. It's hard to prove anything. But, Doctor, we know you've worked on similar cases before, said Robert. I have, but nothing ever came of it. These old cases are impossible to win. Why impossible? Because they're old cases, repeated Dr. Reynolds, clearly nervous. Robert decided to change strategy. Doctor, do you know a man named Joshua? He had a case similar to ours. Dr. Reynolds visibly paled. Joshua? That name doesn't ring a bell. Are you sure? Because we have information that you worked on his case about 15 years ago. No, you must be confusing me with another lawyer. Dr. Reynolds stood up and started pacing nervously around the office. Look, I'll be honest with you. Old expropriation cases are a dead end. You'll spend money and time and won't get anything. Better give up while you still can. Doctor, why are you so nervous? Asked Richard. I'm not nervous. It's just that I've seen many people get hurt because of these old stories. What do you mean get hurt? Dr. Reynolds stopped pacing and looked directly at them. Listen to what I'm going to say. There are things in this town that are better left alone. The Williams are important people who help many folks. It's not worth causing trouble for them. So you admit you know about the case? I'm not admitting anything, just giving some friendly advice. Robert stood up to leave. Thanks for your time, Doctor. But I think we'll look for another lawyer. "You won't find any lawyer in this area who'd want to take this kind of case," said Dr. Reynolds. "And if you find someone from out of town, it'll cause problems for you." "What kind of problems?" Dr. Reynolds realized he'd said too much and didn't respond. Leaving the building, Richard was struck by the lawyer's nervousness. Robert, he was afraid of something. He sure was. And apparently, the Williams have more control over this town than we thought. What do we do now? Now we go straight to the district attorney to report everything we've uncovered. He needs to know this isn't just an isolated case, but a conspiracy that's affected multiple families. At Dr. Henry Sanders's office, they reported all their recent discoveries. "This is getting very serious," said the district attorney after hearing everything. "If there was indeed an organized conspiracy to hide legitimate compensations, we're talking about serious administrative misconduct." "Doctor, can you guarantee our safety?" "What do you mean?" Richard told him about Dr. Reynolds's veiled threats and the pressure Frank Williams was applying. "I'll ask the police to conduct some discreet investigations into the Williams, but you also need to be careful. Don't walk alone at night, don't leave cars in dark places, that sort of thing. Do you think they might do something to us?" "I don't know. But when large amounts of money are involved, people can do desperate things." Dr. Henry promised to speed up the investigation and asked them to return the following week with Mrs. Elaine. That weekend, Richard decided to stay at Catherine's house. He didn't want to be alone at the rural property after all the veiled threats he'd received. On Saturday morning, they went together to visit Mrs. Elaine to invite her to see the district attorney. "Of course I'll go," she said without hesitation. "I should have done this long ago." "Mrs. Elaine, aren't you afraid of retaliation?" asked Catherine. "Dear, when you're 82, fear is something that fades. I want to see justice done before I leave this world." On Monday, the three of them went together to the district attorney's office. Dr. Henry listened carefully to Mrs. Elaine's testimony and was impressed by how many details she remembered. "Mrs. Elaine, would you be willing to help find other descendants of families who went through the same situation?" "I certainly would. I've known many people in this town for decades." "Then here's what we'll do. I'm opening an official investigation into administrative misconduct against the Williams family. You three will help me locate as many affected people as possible." "Doctor." Henry explained that with more victims, the case would be stronger and harder for the Williams to challenge. "But doctor," said Catherine, "how can we do this without them finding out?" "We'll work discreetly. You'll talk to trusted people, explain the situation, and anyone who wants to join the investigation can come directly to my office." Leaving the office, they devised a strategy. Mrs. Elaine would talk to people from the church and the older community. Catherine would speak with people she knew from work and the neighborhood. Richard would try to locate descendants of families who lived in rural areas. Throughout that week, they worked like detectives, quietly speaking with people who might have similar stories. The results were surprising. Mrs. Elaine discovered 3 more families whose grandparents had lost land to the railroad: the Sanders, the Olivers, and the Shaws. Catherine found 2 people with similar stories: a co-worker whose great-grandfather had lost a piece of land, and a neighbor who always heard her family talk about money that was never paid by the government. Richard found something even more interesting. While talking to his neighbor, Mr. Gerald, a 70-year-old man, he learned that there was a local legend about a lost treasure related to the railroad. "Richard, my father always said that somewhere there were documents proving that many families were entitled to money from the government," said Mr. Gerald. "He said that one day someone would find those documents and the truth would come out." "Did your father ever see those documents?" "No, but he knew a railroad employee who said the papers were hidden somewhere safe." "Who was that employee?" "His name was Benjamin Carter, but he passed away about 20 years ago." "Did he leave any family?" "He left a son, John Carter. He lives here in town, works at the mechanic shop on Commerce Street." At the end of the week, when they gathered to share their findings, they had identified at least 8 families that potentially had claims to unpaid compensation. "Guys, this is much bigger than we thought," said Catherine. "It is," agreed Richard. "And there's one more thing. I need to talk to John Carter. His father was a railroad employee and might know important things." On Saturday morning, Richard went to the mechanic shop looking for John Carter. He was a man of about 50, tall and strong, with hands always dirty with grease. "John, can I talk to you about your father, Benjamin Carter?" "Sure. But why?" Richard briefly explained the situation about the unpaid compensation. John stopped what he was doing and looked seriously at Richard. "Son, my father carried a secret about this until the day he died." "What secret?" "He always said he knew where the compensation documents were hidden, but he never wanted to tell me because he said it was dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "He said that important people in town didn't want those documents to surface, and that anyone who messed with it could get hurt." John put down his tools and went to a cabinet at the back of the shop. "But before he died, he left me this," he said, showing a yellowed envelope. "What is it?" "I never opened it. He said to only open it if someone came asking the right questions about the railroad compensation." "And do you think I'm asking the right questions?" John looked at Richard for a few seconds before answering. "I think so." He carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small map. The letter said, "To whoever finds this letter, my name is Benjamin Carter. I was an employee of the Central American Railroad between 1938 and 1965. In 1963, I received an order from Mayor John Williams to hide all documents related to the pending compensation for the Clearwater section. These compensations were legitimate and should have been paid, but the mayor said they would cause political problems. I hid the documents at the location shown on the map because I believed that one day justice would be done. If someone is reading this, it means the time has come for the truth to emerge." The map showed a specific location, an abandoned rail car on the old railroad tracks. "John," said Richard with a trembling voice, "this is the same rail car where I found the documents." "What do you mean?" Richard told the whole story of how Snowball had led him to the rail car and about the documents he had found. "So, you already found my father's documents?" asked John, surprised. "I found some, but from what's written in this letter there might be more." "Let's go check," said John, closing the shop. The two, accompanied by Snowball, who seemed to understand the importance of the moment, returned to the abandoned railroad car. This time they searched more systematically. John knew the place well because he had played there as a child, before the vegetation took over everything. "Richard, look here," said John, pointing to a part of the car that seemed to have been modified. It was a small secret compartment, disguised between the wooden walls. When they managed to open it, they found 3 more boxes of documents. The first box contained documents similar to those Richard had already found, but from different families. The second box had something surprising: correspondence between John Williams and federal government officials, discussing how to resolve the compensation issue in a way that would not cause political inconvenience. The third box contained what was most valuable of all: payment receipts that had been issued, but never delivered to the beneficiaries. "John, do you see this?" said Richard, showing one of the receipts. It was a payment receipt for $80,000 to Sebastian Oliver regarding expropriation compensation. The receipt was signed and stamped, but had never been delivered. "My God," murmured John. "They really took the money that belonged to the families." "What do you mean, took? Think about it. If the receipts were issued, it means the federal government released the money, but if the receipts were never delivered, where did that money go?" Richard understood immediately. Someone had received the compensation payments instead of the rightful families. They spent hours cataloging all the documents. In total, they found evidence that 12 different families were entitled to compensation they never received. The total amount, with monetary correction and interest, would be enough to transform the lives of all these families. "John, do you want to join us in this fight?" "Yes, I do. My father kept this secret his whole life, hoping someone would do the right thing. The time has come." On Monday, the 4 of them met at the public prosecutor's office to present the new findings. Dr. Henry was impressed with the amount of evidence. "With these documents, we have a solid case not only of administrative misconduct, but also of misappropriation of public funds," he said. "What does that mean in practice?" asked Catherine. "It means the Williamses can be forced to return all the money that was diverted, with monetary correction and interest, and they can be imprisoned. And how long could that take? With all this evidence, the process could be faster, perhaps 6 months to a year. Dr. Henry explained that he would immediately file a public civil action against the Williams family and also report the case to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, since it involved federal funds. You need to be prepared for a strong reaction from the Williamses. They won't accept this passively. The reaction wasn't long in coming. On Tuesday, Frank Williams called Richard personally. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk urgently." "About what?" "About the recent misunderstandings. I can increase my previous offer." "Congressman, there is no offer that interests me anymore. The case is already in court." "Mr. Thompson, you don't understand the gravity of the situation. There are very powerful people involved in this, people who won't like this story being stirred up at all." "What people?" "I can't talk about it over the phone, but I can assure you that if you don't withdraw this action, the consequences could be very bad for your family." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to protect you." Richard hung up the phone and immediately called the public prosecutor to report the conversation. "Richard, I'm going to request police protection for you. This kind of threat cannot be ignored." On Wednesday, 2 plainclothes officers showed up at Catherine's house, where Richard was staying. "We're from the Special Police Unit. We're setting up a protection detail for you until this situation is resolved." "Is that really necessary?" asked Catherine. "Ma'am, when there's a lot of money involved and powerful people are being accused, it's always better to be cautious." The following days were tense. Richard and Catherine were practically confined, only leaving when accompanied by the officers. On Friday, Dr. Henry called with important news. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has taken the case. They're conducting an operation on Monday to seize all the documents at City Hall and the Williams offices." "Is that good?" "It's excellent. It means the case is being taken seriously by federal authorities." Over the weekend, the whole town was talking about the FBI's arrival. The news had leaked, and people were speculating about what might be happening. Mrs. Elaine called Catherine excited. "Dear, the whole town is talking. I think the truth will finally come out." "I hope so, Mrs. Elaine, I hope so." On Monday morning, Richard woke up to the sound of helicopters. From Catherine's window, he could see several FBI vehicles arriving in town. The operation lasted all day. They seized documents at City Hall, the municipal building, the Williams offices, and even at Frank Williams' house. In the late afternoon, Dr. Henry called with the first updates. "Richard, you won't believe what the FBI found." "What is it?" "Bank accounts in the Williams family's name with deposits that exactly match the amounts of the compensation that should have been paid to the families. They really stole the money." "It appears so, and there's evidence that this happened not only with the railroad compensation, but with other government projects over the years." "How much money are we talking about?" "They're still calculating, but it could be over $5 million. Richard was silent for a few seconds, processing the information. "Dr. Henry, does this mean we'll get the compensation?" "It means you have a very good chance, but the legal process will still take a few months." That evening, the families involved gathered at Mrs. Elaine's house to discuss next steps. Present were Richard, Catherine, John Carter, Mrs. Elaine, and 6 other people representing other affected families. "Everyone," said Mrs. Elaine, "I never thought I'd see this day. Justice finally being served." "Mrs. Elaine, it's not over yet," said John. "The Williamses have a lot of money and good lawyers. They'll try to defend themselves." "But now we have the FBI on our side," Catherine reminded them. They talked about how to organize the families to follow the legal process and the possibility of hiring a specialized lawyer to represent everyone. "I know a lawyer in Portland who works with cases of administrative misconduct," said John. "We can talk to him." Over the next few weeks, the case gained national attention. Newspapers and TV stations came to town to cover the story of the families fighting for compensation that had been hidden for decades. Frank Williams was removed from his position as state representative and had his bank accounts frozen. His father, Robert Williams, a former mayor, was also indicted. The town was divided. Some supported the families and celebrated that the truth had come out. Others, who depended economically on the Williamses, were worried about the future. Richard and Catherine decided it was time to return to the farm. The injunction had been lifted after it was proven that the accusations against the deed's legitimacy were false. "Richard," said Catherine as they were tidying things up, "do you realize how much our life has changed in just a few weeks?" "I do. And it all started with Snowball taking me to that train car." "Do you think it was a coincidence?" "I don't know. But sometimes I think there's some greater force that makes things happen at the right time." Snowball was lying on the living room floor, as if he understood they were talking about him. The dog had become a local celebrity after the story spread. "You know what, Catherine? Regardless of the money we might receive, the most important thing is that we got our family back. That's true, we spent 3 years fighting for nothing. It wasn't for nothing. We needed to go through that to learn how to really talk to each other." 2 months later, Dr. Henry called with the news everyone had been waiting for. "Richard, the federal judge fully accepted our lawsuit. The families will be entitled to receive all compensation with monetary correction and interest." "How long until we receive it?" "The money should be available within 60 days. The federal government will take over the payment and then recover it from the Williamses through the assets that were frozen." "And how much will each family receive?" "Your family is entitled to approximately $450,000. Mrs. Elaine will receive $300,000. John Carter, representing his father's family, $200,000. The other families will receive amounts between $100,000 and $300,000. Richard couldn't speak for a few seconds. It was more money than he had ever imagined in his life. "Dr. Henry, thank you so much for everything." "It is I who should thank you. It was your courage that brought justice to so many families." The following week, all the families gathered again at Mrs. Elaine's house to celebrate the victory. "Everyone," she said with tears in her eyes, "my grandfather can rest in peace now." "Mrs. Elaine, what are you going to do with the money?" asked one of Sebastian Oliver's granddaughters. "I'm going to renovate my house, help my grandchildren, and make a donation to the church. But the most important thing is that the truth has come out." John Carter was emotional. "Folks, my father would be very proud if he knew that the documents he hid served to bring justice." "John, your father was a hero," said Richard. "If it weren't for his courage in hiding the documents, the truth would never have come out." The party lasted until late at night. These were families that had suffered for generations because of an injustice, and now saw the situation being rectified. When Richard and Catherine returned home, they talked on the porch until dawn. "Richard, have you thought about what you're going to do with the money?" "Yes, first I'll invest in the property, buy new equipment, improve the infrastructure. Second, I'll set aside a portion for our retirement. And third, I want to use part of the money to help other people." "What do you mean, help other people?" "I thought about creating a small cooperative to help local farmers who are facing financial difficulties. Nothing too big, but something that makes a difference." "Good idea. And I thought about going back to school. I've always wanted to get a college degree, but I never had the means." "Catherine, you can do anything you want now. It's strange to think about it, spending your whole life with financial struggles and suddenly having this freedom. But we deserve it, Catherine. Our family went through a lot of suffering because of other people's greed." A few days later, Frank Williams was taken into preventive custody. The Federal Bureau of Investigations had discovered that the scheme of misappropriation of public funds was much larger than initially imagined. The city was undergoing a transformation. Many people who had always been afraid to question the Williamses were starting to talk about other corruption problems in the city administration. Richard received an unexpected phone call from the current mayor, who wasn't from the Williams family. "Mr. Richard, I'd like to invite you to a meeting at City Hall." "About what?" "We want to invite you to join a municipal council to help reorganize the city's administration. People who have the courage to fight corruption are exactly what we need right now." Richard was surprised by the invitation. "Mayor, I'll think about it. But can you explain what kind of work it would be?" "It would be an advisory council, unpaid, but with the power to oversee and suggest improvements in municipal management. We want honest people to help us rebuild the public's trust." I'll talk to my family and give you an answer next week." That night, Richard talked to Catherine about the invitation. "What do you think?" "I think you should accept. You've proven you have the courage to face corruption, and you can help other people who are suffering injustices. But I don't understand anything about public administration." "Richard, you don't need to understand everything. You have something more important: honesty and determination." "I accept, then." 3 months later, the compensation money was finally released. All the families gathered at the bank to receive the official payment. It was a historic moment for the town. Journalists were present to document the end of an injustice that had lasted more than 70 years. Mrs. Elaine, despite being 83 years old, insisted on going to the bank in person. "This is the most important day of my life," she told the journalists. "It's not about the money, it's about justice." Richard and Catherine equally split the $450,000 that the family was entitled to receive. In the late afternoon, after all the bank formalities, the families gathered one last time in the town's central square. "Everyone," said John Carter, "I think we should do something to mark this moment in the town's history." "What are you thinking?" asked Richard. "How about we create a memorial for the families who suffered injustices? Something that reminds future generations that the fight for justice is worth it." Everyone liked the idea. They decided to contribute part of the money received to create a small memorial in the square with the names of all the affected families and a text telling the story. "And Snowball's name has to be on the memorial," said Catherine, making everyone laugh. "Why Snowball?" asked Mrs. Elaine. "Because if he hadn't taken my brother to that train car, none of this would have happened." Everyone agreed that Snowball deserved to be remembered as the four-legged hero of the story. 6 months later, the memorial was inaugurated. It was a simple but beautiful structure with a bronze plaque telling the whole story. Richard was on the municipal council and was helping implement several improvements in the city administration. Catherine had enrolled in a pedagogy course and was loving studying. The farm was prospering with the investments Richard had made. He had bought new equipment, renovated the facilities, and was producing more than ever. But most importantly, the family was united again. On the 1-year anniversary of the discovery of the documents, Richard, Catherine, and Snowball returned to the abandoned train car. "Look how the vegetation has grown even more," said Catherine. "Yeah. Soon it'll be completely hidden again." They stood in silence for a few minutes, remembering everything that had happened in that place. "Richard, do you ever think about what would have happened if Snowball hadn't brought you here?" "I do. Probably I would have lost the property because of the debts. You would still be mad at me. The other families would never have received justice. It's amazing how a small event can change so much. Catherine, do you know what I learned from all this?" "What?" "That sometimes we need to have the courage to follow what seems not to make sense. If I hadn't followed Snowball that day, none of this would have happened. And I learned that family is the most important thing there is. Money comes and goes, but family is forever." Snowball ran up to them, as if agreeing with the conversation. "And you, Snowball, what did you learn?" asked Richard, petting the dog. Snowball barked once and wagged his tail, seeming to say he was satisfied with the work done. 2 years later, the story of the families of Clearwater became a book written by a journalist who had covered the case. The book became a regional bestseller and helped inspire other people to fight against similar injustices. Richard and Catherine were invited to give talks in several cities, sharing their experience and encouraging others not to give up when they know they are right. Frank Williams was sentenced to 12 years in prison for embezzlement and administrative misconduct. His father, Robert Williams, received a lesser sentence due to his advanced age, but also had to return a significant portion of the family's assets. The town of Clearwater underwent a complete transformation. With more transparent administration and the end of the political dominance of the Williamses, new investments came to the region. Rural tourism grew, new jobs were created, and the quality of life improved for everyone. Mrs. Elaine, at 85 years old, remained active and became a sort of informal counselor for people facing injustice problems. Her house always had someone asking for advice or just chatting. John Carter expanded his auto repair shop, and created a training program for young people in the town to learn a trade. He always said he wanted to give back to the community the good he had received. Richard fulfilled his dream of creating a cooperative to help small rural producers. The cooperative grew and began serving not only Clearwater but also neighboring towns. Catherine graduated in education and started working at the municipal school, focusing on citizenship and rights education projects. She always told the students the story of her family's struggle as an example that it's worth fighting for what is right. And Snowball? Snowball became a local celebrity. He had a special little house on Richard's property, got treats from all the neighbors, and whenever he saw children on the street, he was greeted with celebration. The dog seemed to understand his importance in the story and walked through the town with an air of dignity that made everyone smile. On some afternoons when Richard was working on the property, Snowball still ran toward the place where the railroad car was, as if wanting to make sure everything was in order. "You're making sure no one hides any more injustices around here, aren't you, boy?" Richard always said, and Snowball barked once, as if confirming. End of story. What did you think of this story of courage and justice? Can you imagine how many families across America might be going through similar situations? Leave your thoughts in the comments about the importance of fighting for our rights. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories that make us reflect on our society.